The first words I will say in Basque, so. Niretzako benetako plazerra eta orea da ezagutzen ditudan bi lankide aurkeztu alizatea eta uste dut oso elkarrizketa eta eztabaida interesgarria izango dugula ondoren. It's a real pleasure for me to welcome you, and my name is José Ramón Bengoechea, as you can now see. I'm one of the locals from the University of the Basque Country, and I deal with precisely the issues that Daniel Innerarity was calling for, that is the philosophy of European law. So I guess maybe there is a scope, at least for this sort of discipline and discourse. And I think it's a very welcome time and theme to have brought to the discussion and to the floor now. But my job is first of all to introduce our speakers, and we're going to have some, I think, very interesting presentations on issues that are going to hinge on the question of the value of narratives, maybe also one of the greatest challenges to the narrative, in this case, maybe the UK challenge and its understanding of what the whole process of integration is about, and other ways of even questioning the narratives by Jan Komarek, and I think also in Renaud's point of view, this idea of a platform of modes of understanding the integration. So Carlos Closa is senior researcher at the Center for Scientific Research in Spain, and has for the last years been visiting and working at the European University Institute. He's a very well-known political scientist in Spain, but has also very profound knowledge of the legal and institutional complex of the European Union, and is one of the first academics in Spain who actually studied the European Union from this political science and also constitutional perspective. So it's rare in that sense because he does combine the normative and the descriptive empirical baggages that Daniel was talking about. Jan is how would I say, is a colleague. I first met Jan in Oxford at the early 2000s, I think, and is now at the London School of Economics, and but lives in Prague. So he's he's Czech of origin, and a Czech and European citizen who works at the London School of Economics in London. So a global European at that. And Renaud Thillaye, who's working at the Policy Network, he will explain when his time comes what Policy Network is all about, and we'll give him this 5 minutes of publicity to say what this think tank is about. But he just told me, it was a pleasure just meeting you now. We didn't know each other before, but he just told me that he's the non-academic. But I think this is precisely also part of the merit of the panel this morning also, that we're going to combine different sorts of approaches. Without further ado, I give the floor to Carlos. You have 20 minutes for your presentation, and I'll be controlling the time.
Thank you very much, José Ramón, for your kind presentation. And let me start by thanking both Governance and Daniel Innerarity and the London School of Economics and Jonathan White for this very kind invitation. This is the second time I'm speaking at this forum. The first one was 2 years ago, and I think there is a continuity between the themes. In that occasion, we're reflecting about the crisis. Now we are speaking about a narrative. And I think that the invitation to be here has more to do with the friendship that I think that Daniel has for me, rather than my capacity to bring any kind of meaningful contribution to this debate. I'm going to try something which is very specific, very punctual, that perhaps underlines some of the elements I think that should be included in the narrative, but I don't consider myself to be ready to launch, to throw for discussion a proposal for a new narrative. I think narratives may be important, and here I show a little bit my, not my skepticism, but rather my doubts as a kind of more empirical political scientist. I don't really have a fixed position whether narratives should be important or are important or not. They're important, of course, in terms of political mobilization, but in terms of normative theory, I'm not totally sure whether narratives are that important if there are not underlying elements in the structure of the polity that respond to those narratives. And I think what is important is the underlying structure of the polity, and that's my main concern. Perhaps this is a contradiction to something was said in the introduction. Nevertheless, I'm going to, as I say, I'm going to focus on something very, very specific here. I'm going to talk about exit, I'm going to talk about withdrawal, I'm going to talk about Article 50 of the treaty, very specific provision and very specific theme for this broader conference. Let me start with a paradox, the in and out paradox. I have a friend of mine, a dear friend, a great intellectual, recognized intellectual, that says that in and out, being in and out is not really relevant because we are permanently negotiating our identities, and in the process from leaving a place, we change our identity, but we also change the identity of the people who are left behind. And the same thing happens when we do the opposite transit. My friend has got this very strong view on the issue. Does it matter? Perhaps does it matter? The response is no. Perhaps I think here characters play an important role. Me, myself, being from a different part of Spain, from Galicia, I have a different attitude to the response. Galician people are known through perhaps two stereotypes. The first stereotype will say that you never know whether a Galician is walking up or down the staircase. The other stereotype is that Galicians always respond to a question with another question, or perhaps with a different thing, which is, it depends. You never have a final response. And it depends very much who says whether it matters or not. Here perhaps we have a powerful image for subject in which, for which being in and out is relevant. These are images that are known to you, so there's no necessity to explain. For these people, perhaps the important thing is, in an in and out equation, is the circle you have around the in. So to speak about being in, first you need to have this circle constructed. And if you're speaking about a multi-level organization, you have just several levels, several circles, but the outer circle is always constructed. So it doesn't matter who says that. And for some people, it may look like the European Union is something which is closed and you are excluded from it and out of it. So in my perception, in and out matters a lot. But I'm not going to speak really about in and out. I'm not going to talk about that. The focus of my talk and what I want to say here is the process, is how we move from the in and out. And what I call perhaps the way to Ithaca, which is a very well-known myth in the Western and in the European context, or for those who are acquainted with the Spanish literature, what I will call the Machado Doctrina, which is we don't have a path, the path is made when we walk on it. And I think that's the important point. The important point is not whether you are in and out or in, out. The important thing is how you walk the path from in to out or from out to in. And I'm going to do that in reference, and now I'm going to enter really into the subject of my presentation, in relation to the, as I said, to Article 50 of the treaty, the exit, the withdrawal clause. But I will refer first to a classical seminal work of Joseph Weiler, The Transformation of Europe, in which he constructed the relation between exit and voice as the basic transformation that Europe suffered from 57 onwards through the process of European integration. I will try to show how this has happened. And then I will try to link that to the development with the Lisbon Treaty, the inclusion of the full exit, which is the withdrawal clause in Article 50, and what effects it has got on the classical transformation that Weiler depicted in the 90s. Then I will try to introduce a reflection about loyalty, which is an element that is normally missing in the discussion about exit and voice. And finally, I will try to draw some conclusions in relation to the effects that introducing this full exit element produces in the voice mechanism, mainly directing towards selective exit. This is the structure of my presentation. Let me move very quickly to the first point. As you know, and this is, I think, is perhaps a little bit insulting that I repeat this in an environment like this, but nevertheless, I think it's fair to remember the work of Hitchman. Hitchman constructed the three mechanisms: exit, voice, and loyalty, in a very specific way. Hitchman spoke about exit as a very economic mechanism, and by economic he meant absolutely utilitarian, in the sense that actors use exit in a calculus of costs and benefits. And for Hitchman, exit meant leaving a product, and the initial work of Hitchman is on consumers and marketing, leaving a product because deterioration or consumer insatisfaction. Hitchman argued that the mechanism for correcting the dissatisfaction with the product was increasing voice, which meant that consumers wanted to have demanded improvement in the product they were usually consuming. And exit was the kind of mechanism that guaranteed that voice was heard. Notice that in Hitchman, even though there were three elements, loyalty was not extensively dealt at this stage. What is interesting for our discussions here is the adaptation that Joseph Weiler, the current president of the European University Institute, did in '92 in his transformation of Europe of the Hitchman mechanism. And Weiler argued that the European Union has produced, creating this organization, has produced a closer what he called selective exit. And by that he meant that the member states renounced to selectively apply European Union law, and they accepted the jurisprudence of the European Court of Justice in exchange by an increase on voice. An increase on voice in Weiler's construction was an increase on intergovernmental decision making. So the increased role of the Council was related to the closure of selective exit. European Union law, primacy, direct effect, and direct applicability is changed by intergovernmental decision making. Full exit, withdrawal, did not play in Weiler's construction any specific role, even though acted as the last guarantee of compliance. So states comply because they know that they could leave the union. It didn't like the union law. Now, what has happened historically, and Weiler was writing in '92, and he was really reflecting on the works that he did from the 80s, and specifically from '82, '83, and '84, which I think are the key years to understand Weiler's work. What Weiler perhaps ignored in his work was because it was not really seen when he was writing in '92, is the subtle entrance of a different form of selective exit, which appeared specifically from the Single European Act and onwards. In the Single European Act, for the first time, we had the introduction of the Social Charter. I don't know what you remember, in '88. And the Social Charter was applied for all the member states of the European Union but one, United Kingdom. So what happened from the 80s onwards was the emergence of this mechanism of selective exit, in which you can really sign up for a certain part of the community, the European Union acquis, but not necessarily for the whole package. My thesis here is that, and I'm going to say very directly and very clear, is that this explicit exit provision that have been introduced by the Treaty of Lisbon, Article 50, changed deeply the balance between voice and selective exit and erode loyalty. So it's a whole transformation, a retransformation of the Europe we have inherited, and as was described by Weiler. Let me say some things about Article 50, and I'm not going to be very legal, but I think some things have to be said in legal terms because they are relevant for normative purposes. What are the characteristics of Article 50, the withdrawal clause, the possibility of leaving the Union? 3 elements I think are very relevant here. First is an unconditional clause. So there is no need to verify preliminary conditions by the state that wants to withdraw from the European Union. And it's totally unmotivated. So a state does not need to motivate the reasons to leave the Union. In this respect, this provision does not integrate any kind of consideration of fairness or justice vis-à-vis what is left behind. And that goes speaking about the in and out dynamic we were saying. I was saying at the very beginning of my presentation. Second characteristic of this clause is unilateral, and that means that it doesn't depend on the other member states of the European Union granting any kind of consent of agreement to the withdrawal state. And final characteristic, which perhaps is not so relevant for our discussion here, is not immediate. There is a cooling off period. Now, the question here is why withdrawal has become such an explicit right. It was implicit in the former European Union before the Lisbon Treaty. Basically, the doctrine will argue that even though it was not written, withdrawal was implicit in the European Union treaties. Why has it become implicit? One interpretation suggests that it was a kind of mechanism to ensure reluctant states, like Britain, about their membership of the European Union and to make them feel more comfortable. And I think this is a very say, compassionate or keen or nice interpretation of the origin of Article 50. I want to add to that perhaps a much more skeptical view, and I say that Article 50, or this full exit provision, has served to a very specific purpose, which is releasing European Union law from the strictness that is implicit in classic international public law. Article 62 of the Vienna Convention, of the law on the treaties, and I'm not going to be more technical than this, requires explicitly that when states withdraw from the European Union, they have to justify that there is a change of the conditions, and that the change of the condition affects to those conditions that were essential to their belonging to the European Union. By introducing Article 50 in the treaties, we paradoxically have increased the autonomy of the European Union vis-à-vis classical international law, but paradoxically, we have increased the margin of maneuver for member states, which is a total paradox. We are asserting a union in which the autonomy of member states is questioned because we said that we put sovereignty, but then we introduce a mechanism that serves to root precisely this notion of reducing the margin of maneuver for member states. What I want to suggest is that the effects of this provision are much more important than can be seen on a first view. And I'm going to say that by making loyalty appear in this discourse. As you have seen so far, I haven't mentioned loyalty. Loyalty in Hitchman construction is a highly utilitarian construction. It's different to the moral notion of loyalty. Hitchman means by loyalty the willingness of consumers, of members of organization, to address product deterioration, requesting improvement. And there is a kind of bilateral relation between loyalty and voice. Loyalty increases the tendency to seek voice, and voice increases loyalty. So in Hitchman, this relation is very well constructed in a bilateral way. But it is not the same kind of bilateral relation between loyalty and exit. What you find in Hitchman works is that loyalty is functional when voice requires some kind of social inventiveness, and exit is not wholly effective option, which is the situation with the European Union. We can argue that exit is there, but exit is perhaps problematic for any member state because of political and economical consideration. Now, my question is, what happens when we consider the relation from exit to loyalty? And here what I want to argue is that the introduction of this full exit erodes loyalty. How it does erodes loyalty? It erodes loyalty because the full exit clause, in the sense I have described before, unconditional, unilateral, almost unlimited, allows a construction of product deterioration which is not loyal, so to say. A loyal interpretation of product deterioration, you will find it perhaps in the sample of the Cecchini report on the cost of non-Europe. I don't know, the ones who are perhaps younger do not remember this report, but it was a key report in '88 in which it explains what will be the effects of not accomplishing the internal market for the whole of Europe. So there was a diagnosis for the deterioration of the product, the market, a mechanism how to correct that for the whole of the European Union. What we have as an alternative to this traditional discourse of loyal product deterioration is the kind of diagnosis we are now seeing in some areas of the continent, which center in different aspects. For instance, we have this discourse about the deterioration of the European Union Constitution. I'm not going to enter very much into the detail. There is a wonderful report from the Center for European Reform, wonderful report that summarizes all the arguments around this deterioration of the economic constitution of the European Union. There is an alternative. There is an alternative diagnosis of the Dutch and British government, centering in another thing, which is the creeping competence, which concludes that the balance of competence is about right, paradoxically. So there is no case for repatriation. The same can be said about the first case I haven't mentioned, but the same report of the Center for European Reform concludes that it's not correct to affirm that the European economic constitution has been deteriorated, quite the opposite. Now, in summary, empirical evidence does not show any evidence of declining performance in relation at least to the classical things which are the economic constitution, creeping competence, although of course there may be other events in which this can be shown. If you look at the more recent European Kingdom government demands, what you have there is an interesting diagnosis again. What is the deterioration of the product? The deterioration of the product is that apparently the integrity of the single market is not respected. My question here is, has it ever been threatened at all? I mean, we have in Europe something, we have a market. The rights of the European non-Euro member states have not been respected, but we know that the European Kingdom has even secured nowadays, before any reform, that the agreements between the ECOFIN members had to be subjected to an afterwards scrutiny by the members who are not part of the Euro. The European Kingdom government also demands increasing competitiveness, speaking about measures that the British business call for, cut the burden for British businesses, and so on and so forth. Third element of diagnosis, sovereignty, and the British obligation to work towards an ever-closer union in a formal, legally binding, irreversible way, and it's something of a paradox that the United Kingdom government requires the European Union to set at the European Union level an irreversibility of a commitment that has to be implemented domestically. So it's a kind of contradiction in terms. And finally, of course, the third element of the United Kingdom government demands refers to the reduction of the flows of population. In a nutshell, my point here, and I'm going to be very quick because José Ramón is already asking me to finish, is that this kind of diagnosis enters in the same kind of situation that I have described before. Unloyal construction, and unloyal in the sense that is not a fair description of product deterioration of the European Union. What are the effects? The effects that there is a change in the voice mechanism. Weiler described, as you remember, Weiler described that there was a trade-off between selective exit, which means application of the full legal acquis, and voice. What we have now is a permanent seek of a mechanism for selective exit that become the alternative to the traditional voice. So selective exit now has become the alternative to traditional voice. And this is a paradox because we are in a situation in which, as many authors have argued, intergovernmental decision-making, which is the traditional voice, has also increased. So we have a situation in which we have voice plus voice, or voice plus selective exit. A number of examples can really describe this situation. First, the possibility of repatriating competence, which is now Article 42, and has been, again, not noticed very much how this has changed the structure of the European Union. The very different forms of flexibility, opt-outs, opt-ins, ad-hoc derogations, variable geometry, and multi-tier. And something which I think should be perhaps carefully mentioned, I will finish it now, carefully mentioned, is something that appears in the United Kingdom government demands, which is addressing European Court of Justice judgments that have within it, the scope of free movement. I think what is important here is not so much the subject, free movement, but rather the fact that the government is asking explicitly to address European Court of Justice judgments. What does it mean? We are going to reverse politically what has been achieved in the legal field? Or does it mean that we are really to not apply European Court of Justice judgments? There is no specification in the United Kingdom paper about this specific issue, but nevertheless enlarges very much the area for full exit. Now, this, of course, in a situation in which any reform is protected by the unanimity requirement and creates increasing needs to bypass the strictness of the procedure and advance by mechanisms that are outside the treaties, as the fiscal compact has proven. Those are the outcomes I am describing. I'm finishing now. Those are the outcomes I am describing. Probably the situation of selective exit that I am describing here describes a kind of out situation, a kind of semi-detached situation for the European acquis, from the European Union acquis. And then coming back to my first question, do they matter at all? And I think they do matter. Do they matter because of two things? First, there is a deeply utilitarian calculation in terms of cost and benefits, which is not necessarily real. The diagnosis does not need to be loyal. The diagnosis can be any diagnosis whatsoever is acceptable, which derive from changing domestic circumstances. So we are perhaps heading to a European Union in which utilitarian calculation, deprived of any kind of narrative which is based on values, becomes more important. And I think one of the biggest casualties of this process is the loss of solidarity. I know that some of you may perhaps object to the idea that we put on the table thick values of solidarity, but I think there are a number of empirical processes now in the European Union that are proving how this is happening. We have the sample of the Greek crisis and how certain countries have reacted to that. I don't want to put the emphasis on the behavior of Germany, but perhaps it would be worthwhile to underline the fact that the United Kingdom government said from the very beginning that was not its matter of concern. Something similar could be said about the very recent case with the refugee quota system, in which a similar attitude towards solidarity as the kind of value-driving policy forward does not appear in the position of certain member states. Specifically, I will be referring to the United Kingdom. And here I have a quotation that argues that we are concerned that the government will fail to live up to its duty of solidarity and undersharing between member states during an emergency situation. So there is a strong denunciation of lack of solidarity from the United Kingdom government, which is not coming from any radical author or any radical player. It's coming from the House of Lords. The House of Lords is even appreciating that there is a lack of solidarity. To conclude, what I wanted to convey to you is that, in my perception, we are in a situation in which the whole equilibrium that while detecting the transformation of Europe between exit and voice has been changed in a situation in which loyalty has been deeply eroded and permitted a number of selective exit mechanisms that fitting again in the loop of eroding loyalty. Thank you very much. I know I have been a little bit in a hurry, but I will be very pleased to respond to your questions. So, caricasco. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Carlos. Well, as a moderator, I'm afraid I'm in control of voice, so I have the power to limit the extent and the length of your vote. There is no exit, and not even a selective exit. So,
what about loyalty?
Loyalty is what brings us together on this table, and on this room. So that is given for granted. But now it's a real pleasure to move on to this existential question, which Jan Komarek is going to talk to us about. As I said before, Jan is also coming from this philosophical and legal combination analysis of the institutional study or description with the normative evaluation. And I think we will see some of his questioning of the narratives as an interesting counterpoint now. So, Jan, yours is the floor.
So thank you very much. I just want to assure you that exit is available, so you can always leave through the doors if that becomes too perhaps lengthy or heavy. Also because this is not going to be a smooth presentation of a kind of research I have been doing in the last 2 or 3 years, because I really wanted to respond to the question raised by the organizers, because this is not a sort of question I would be doing in my research, because normally I deal with law, and it's also a way for me to somewhat address the existential problems I have at the LSE, because I came there as a committed lawyer, and I came there in 2010, and then throughout the crisis I became more and more disenchanted with law and became more interested in other narratives. So this is going to be lots of thinking through my paper rather than presenting it to you, and I hope that you will just bear with me. Now, I picked up a sentence from the invitation which said that we should interrogate how should the European integration process look if it is to be fair, and that is to say what is the new narrative which then can relegitimize the European integration process. And I wanted to look at these 3 ideas in the question. So in the first instance, what it means to say that something is legitimate. So in what way we should talk about European Union's legitimacy, and also a question whether the European Union ever was legitimate in some deeper sense. Then I'm also troubled with this word narrative, because to me it suggests the language of spin doctors who advise to politicians how to sell a product to citizens, consumers, rather than a language of civic engagement. So I want to look at this notion of narrative and how it relates to creating the legitimacy of a political organization such as the European Union. And also I want to ask if fairness is really what we want to demand from the European integration. So starting with legitimacy. So just in general, and I know that this is a very mixed audience, so again, it reminds me of my LSE experience, because you never know who you talk to. Is it lawyers or is it political scientists? What kind of vocabulary I should be using so that they will listen to me, and so as I don't say things they know which to me appear new. But I thought it would be useful to just spend some time on thinking about what we mean by legitimacy, because I was also to a conference where Joseph Weiler said that legitimacy is in fact a useless concept, because nobody really knows what it means. So everybody has their own notions of legitimacy. And one of the points is that, well, we may not know what it means, but it's important that we talk about it, and that we, through talking about it, come to some understanding what legitimacy can mean. And in this legitimacy related to narrative and seeing something as a product, then that suggests legitimacy as a concept which is very much linked to what in theory is called sociological notion of legitimacy. So we do not really care why people think something is legitimate, but it's good because they're just accepted as legitimate. The problem with this notion of legitimacy, of course, is that well, they may have very different reasons why they think that something is legitimate. And it doesn't really tell us in some deeper sense that something is legitimate. And that relates to this problem with the European Union, which could have been legitimate on some very undemanding notion of legitimacy, that people simply perhaps didn't care about it because it didn't mean a lot to their lives until quite recently. And then only more recently they rediscovered that the European Union can be quite important to them. And it's also related to what I observe at conferences where lawyers interrogate legitimacy. Because, again, very rarely they would ask what this legitimacy means. And in that sense, Weiler is perhaps right when he also criticized lawyers when they talk about the legitimacy of the Court of Justice. Then what they are really concerned about is how the authority of the European Court of Justice can be accepted or can be increased in the member states, and that relates to the values, the reasons why we think that something is legitimate, which are dear to lawyers. So you will hear a lot about legal certainty, for example, when the authority of EU law is going to be justified. So we have a contract between the member states, and they adopted some rules, and these rules should be abided by. Then perhaps more recently in the narrative concerning the authority of the European Court of Justice and the principle of primacy, there will be people who suggest new justification for this principle, which is equality, but in a way, it's only formal equality between the member states. So saying that it's bad for the legitimacy of European Union law if one court, the German court, is able to impose its views on the relationship between the national constitution and European Union law. And in a way, I'm very sympathetic to this kind of criticism of the now quite fashionable notions of constitutional pluralism and different types of new constitutional theories. But at the same time, I also see it quite problematic, and I feel it when at the LSE we teach our students, and I'm exposing to them a third or fourth judgment of the German Constitutional Court. I feel the urge to apologize to them, like, I'm sorry, I have to present this German Constitutional Court judgment to you, and that's not really the whole story. And then you get even more frustrated when you read their papers on the principle of supremacy, and then they really respond to the way we teach from primacy to them and the legitimacy of European Union law and its authority, and they would refer to the German Constitutional Court as if it was the guiding or the only perspective you can get on the question. So what I call for, and then again, perhaps for many of you it won't be anything new, but it would be definitely relevant for lawyers, is a sort of reflexive thinking about legitimacy. So being interested in why is something deemed legitimate, but also interrogating the reasons why it is deemed legitimate. And you can get this understanding only by participating in such debates. So it's also a reaction to Joseph Weiler's rejection of the question, because I don't think you can get very far with just avoiding the question of legitimacy by saying it doesn't have any fixed meaning, so people don't really know what they are talking about. Because in fact, we can say similar things about democracy, the rule of law, and other values you will find in the first part of the Treaty on the European Union, which few lawyers in fact read because they are not binding rules, right? So that's a very general introduction to how we can talk about legitimacy and how it is relevant to lawyers. Now, moving to the legitimacy of and also in the European Union and in Europe. So this question whether the European Union ever was legitimate. And there is a fascinating book by my colleague from UCL, Claudia Schrag-Sternberg, who looked at how the discourse on legitimacy developed in the European Union. And in fact, she found a constant struggle between keeping the European Union with the people and outside the people. So as long as you can justify the process of the European Union on this undemanding standard that they don't really care, so you can sell it with reference to the ideas of peace and prosperity, because in fact that's what the European Union successfully delivered. But once the European Union is not delivering on these ideas, then you have to open it to the people, but then it becomes very problematic because it becomes political, it becomes contested. So then you again step back and you again present it as something technocratic which will deliver, rather than something which can provide space for contestation, which I suppose is also very much linked to what Renaud is going to talk about. But at the same time, what I observe in constitutional scholarship on the European Union is also a myth which surrounds democracies at the national level. So on the one hand, of course, the democratic and other deficits of the European Union are very much talked about, but then you have a sort of myth of an Eden of national democracies which once were fully democratic, and then they lost it in the process of the European integration. So perhaps the least controversial way how to challenge this perspective is when you look at the countries such as those which joined the European Union in 2004, but also Spain, Portugal, which were joining the European Union meant to become a constitutional democracy. Then you can, I think, say similar things about Italy and Germany after the war. Of course, the story of these countries is much more complex. But I would add also living in London, or, well, not living in London, but working in London. Well, in the UK, when you raise this question, you usually get this start face like, what? Democracy in the European Union, and we need Europe for being democratic? Of course, because they think they are the oldest democracy in the world, which is also not true. because there are others, like in Scandinavia, but you don't tell them. But another point you can raise is if democracy is linked to social justice, to equality, then you may say that what brought democracy, a real democracy to this country, is also it's taking part in the European structures. And what I would add from an Eastern European perspective also, of course, the existence of the countries which definitely were not democratic before 1989. So the pressure of the really existing socialism and its promise, but it's not really linked to the European Union. So now I'm moving to this question of narratives and myths. So why do we have these myths, and what is the place of myths in legitimating something? And I think you can have two views of such myths. A myth of democratic United Kingdom, which has lost its democratic sovereignty in the process of European integration, or the myth of German constitutional democracy, which was or which existed irrespective of Germany's participation in European integration. And one is you can look at them as a kind of false consciousness. So, and in the worst sense, you can look at them as a sort of enlightened false consciousness. That's something my colleague Susan Marks talks about when she talks about the myths of human rights. So in fact, we all know that it's not true, the myth we are trying to sell. So the constitutional scholars from Germany or from the UK, well, in the UK they don't really have, well, they have constitutional scholars, but to have a constitution in the UK is also a complex question. So they know that it's problematic, but still continue in talking and using this talk because it's somewhat useful, cynically, right? Because we can just have this kind of rule and we don't need to question it. So that's a cynical view of the existence of the myth. But a more interesting and I think more promising way how to look at these myths is to look at them as a kind of necessary political fictions that, well, it's in fact a fiction that you have democratic representation where each citizen has equal voice and each citizen is given equal concern by the government, because in reality we know it's not true, but still it's perhaps the best way how to conceptualize the world around us we live in, and well, to accept it and also to somewhat have a chance, or at least a hope, that we can take actively part in it. And what's important in relation to the European Union, and here I want to link this to this notion of narrative and the language of spin doctors. In fact, this myth is also important for the European Union. And in a way, it's undermining the very possibility of having this structure where we can interrogate, where we can question our structures. If we just have very demanding standards for myth complying with reality in the European Union, while at the same time just turning a blind eye on how this myth doesn't really work at the national level, and also not really seeing how they mutually presuppose each other. Now, the last thing and that's what I want to conclude with, is so how do you relate this to the question of Europe, besides this well, it's in fact an obvious point which was raised a long time ago, that we apply different standards to the European Union and to our national structures. But perhaps thinking of it in these, in terms of these political myths which are necessary to maintain some form of government is perhaps a different way how to look at it. Now, how is this relevant for Europe, and how the question of narrative is important here? I think, and that's again not something which would be new, it's perhaps new at a conference of legal scholars who focus on interpreting narrow provisions of the Treaty on the European Union, but again, in this audience it's perhaps not anything new. The problem of Europe is the sense of lost political agency, that in fact we live in a system where we do not believe anymore in this myth. So we somewhat feel oppressed, and we don't see a way how to get out from the condition we are under. And it was, well, not really nicely, but it was powerfully illustrated by the Greek, well, crisis, is it a word to use, in fact, today? Well, the Greek events in the summer, when there was a serious attempt to change the economic structure of the Eurozone, one of its member states, and it completely failed. So that's the sense of lost agency. So what kind of myth would you have to create? And how does it relate to narrative? Now, narrative, in fact, is not just any kind of talking about the European Union. And again, there is an interesting scholarship on the use of political narratives and what these narratives must be. And Frederick Meyers, a scholar from Duke University, has written a nice book on that. And he, as a political scientist, sees political narrative as an instrument to overcome the problem of collective action. So that, in fact, in politics, you always have this problem that, well, you can go to streets, perhaps organize a demonstration, but you need a commitment from people that they are going to follow you and they are going to change something. And then he explored certain narratives, and for him, a narrative is a powerful story. So it must be a personal story, which then is able to mobilize these people. And the question I have, and I of course do not have an answer to, is what would be this story in Europe? So not a narrative as a way of, abstract talking about how great it is in Europe, we have peace, prosperity, which is all true, and I'm happy I live in this period. But what would be this story for Europe which would be able to induce some collective political agency in the European Union? So thank you for listening.
Thank you very much, Jan. That was right on the spot, right on time, so very well done. Now, our next speaker will be Renaud Tillay, and as I said before, he's coming from the Policy Network, and he's going to talk about Europe as a platform. So we're very curious to find out what sort of platform Europe is.
Thank you very much. I have actually a PowerPoint presentation, so I don't know if it's up and if I could use the computer. Or, yeah, maybe we might want to.
So now it's you in the chair, which makes the noise.
Thank you. I think, first of all, like other speakers, I would like to thank very much the organizers and Daniel for inviting me. It's a great opportunity to have this day of open discussion. And yeah, the invitation was very challenging and inviting, basically, to think. So thanks very much for this opportunity. And as you can see, the title of my presentation is also quite broad and sound maybe very ambitious, so decline, resilience, and visions for the future. But in fact, the most important bit is the last one, so the EU as a platform. And it's so a form of thesis or idea which I would like to share with you, and I'm really keen to hear your feedback on that. This presentation is based on a draft paper, which is not an academic paper. So, as it was mentioned, I'm not an academic. I work in a think tank, and in think tanks we try to come up with perhaps new narratives or new concepts which politicians, policymakers can use. It's true that there's always this little voice saying, it might be a bit of spin doctor thinking, or but so we try to be a bit more serious than just providing some communication tricks. So the point with this essay or with this presentation is to capture possible futures for the EU in the context of the crisis we know today. So I will start actually with this narrative of crisis and decline, which we keep hearing. And I have to say, like maybe sometimes I'm a bit tired of it, but let's take a look at it quickly. So here I think it's interesting to borrow from Fukuyama, who talks about institutional decay or political decay. And so Fukuyama's assumption is that when institutions don't adapt or don't adjust to new circumstances, they tend to lose relevance, and their very existence is threatened. Now, what's interesting is that Fukuyama uses this concept of decay in the American context today. But I think it's fair to say that all the critics we hear against the EU can also relate, to this concept. So there's a growing sense of irrelevance, of paralysis of the EU, which is not able to make strategic decisions. And actually, when the EU makes decisions, it is sometimes often contested, as we have seen in Greece. And so I put you here the front page of one of the latest New Statesman issue. I think it was 1 month ago, which is called, it's as simple as that, The End of Europe. And I think it reflects what a lot of people think today, not only in the UK. So I won't spend too much time on explaining why this talk of decline has come up and has developed. I think we are all familiar with this multifaceted crisis. And the most obvious ones, of course, which come to mind are the euro and Schengen. But there are also less obvious ones. So fields in which the EU has proclaimed very high ambitions for years, but it has really struggled to deliver. So it's the case of the single market. We've been hearing now for 15 years, we need to deepen single market integration. Well, actually, if you look at the figures and at trade, it is not really happening. Social Europe, especially a cause which is dear to left-leaning people. Equally, there's a lot of evidence that social Europe has stalled. Climate change, again, target setting. So we have these 20-20-20 targets. Is Europe actually delivering? So we know, for instance, that the EU emission trading scheme is not exactly an example of best practice. Fundamental rights, just to take the example of Hungary, at the core of Europe, serious troubles. And geopolitics, we've had now for 6 years this European External Action Service. Has it really made progress, in terms of the EU speaking with a single voice and being more effective? One can doubt about it. So here I'm just presenting the standard view again. Now, the question is whether the EU public buys this story and whether this declines or crisis actually leads the public to denounce the EU and actually to consider the exit option. Now, here my view is that we need to be a bit cautious, because we clearly anti-EU voice, is getting more louder. So we witness the increasing presence of anti-EU populists. And actually, Eurosceptic rhetoric has also gone mainstream. If you take the example of the UK, which has been mentioned, clearly, I mean, David Cameron's idea to renegotiate, and if he doesn't obtain a good deal, he will walk away. If you look at Eurobarometer's data, so what we have seen is trust falling sharply after 2007 until 2011, 2012, but for 2 or 3 years now it's gone up again. So I think here we need to be a bit cautious. Equally, I mean, on the right-hand side, at the bottom, you have a graph about support to the euro. And what's fascinating, and to me this is really striking, the fact that, in fact, there's in all Eurozone countries today a quite large, comfortable support for the euro. Even in Greece. Actually, in Greece, it has increased between 2007 and today. Now, maybe it tells something about people realizing through the crisis that actually this currency has a value. You know, it doesn't come at any cost. Now, I would like to spend 5 minutes on now taking the opposite view, the counterintuitive view, saying that in fact, despite this talk of crisis and decline, there are clear underlying unnoticed realities of European integration. So if you look at the institutional dynamics, instead of paralysis, in fact, what we have seen over the last few years, it's some form of gymnastics, so some form of legal creativity. So it was the case with the Lisbon Treaty. In the Eurozone crisis, we had these two initiatives for intergovernmental treaties, so the ESM and the fiscal treaty. And I'm pretty certain we're going to see as well institutional gymnastics to solve the UK problem. So we'd have some form of protocol, something. Now, beyond constitutional, beyond the constitutional remit, if you look at the broader EU policy-making process, I think here the new intergovernmentalism theory is quite interesting to basically evidence the fact that integration has gone forward, but by different means. So by means of coordination, not by means of the community method. Member states or national governments today use the EU as a problem-solving facility or tool. So they go to Brussels with a problem, they seek a solution at the European Council table, and then you have either the European Commission or independent regulatory agencies which implement the mandate which member states collectively give to them. So it's quite different from what we were used to with the community methods, the Commission initiatives, and so on. But in fact, it has helped Europe move forward. And this, I would even go further by defending the idea that there has been also through the crisis further Europeanization, both at elite level and at people's level. On the one side, at elite level, there has been, and it's very counterintuitive, I admit, but there has been intellectual convergence and policy convergence. Intellectual convergence, I think, you know, if I refer to the Lisbon strategy or the Europe 2020 strategy, usually the reaction is, oh yeah, it doesn't work. Well, actually, what's interesting with these strategies is that they provide a vision of some form of socio-economic consensus. You know, what does Europe stand for? What is the vision, the long-term vision? And the vision is one of a social market economy, responsible from an environmental point of view. Can refer to the concept of flexicurity, social investment. These are concepts which are not really contested today, not from the center-right, not from the center-left. In terms of policies, despite lots of talk of divergences, and there are clear divergences, I'm not denying that, youth unemployment, the sense that southern member states are really struggling, but fact is for a couple of years there has also been some rebalancing, so fiscal and macroeconomic. Living standards, especially in Central Europe and Baltic states, have continued catching up with Western European standards, and so on. And finally, to conclude on this section, I think it's important also not to ignore the Europeanization of daily lives, which we all experience, I'm sure. But it's not only true for a very privileged elite. It's not only true for people who live abroad in another member states, but there is this interesting concept of virtual mobility, which I think captures quite well what is happening in Europe today. So it's a concept which was put forward by a research project called UCross a couple of years ago. And they evidence, for instance, that I think more than 50% of people have contacts in another country or with another country on a regular basis, that they watch I don't know, videos or films from another country in another language and so on. So people might stay in their country, in their member states, but they live. They are increasingly aware of living in a European space. Now, so having taken this opposite view and trying to counterbalance, the perception that Europe is on the verge of collapse, what might actually be the way forward? And if the EU is not about to collapse, if exit is not an option, what kind of narratives or vision can we cling on to reflect on the future? So I started by look at traditional visions. I think it relates well to what Daniel said, the first one. The first one is basically ever closer union. We have to integrate, otherwise the whole thing will collapse. Europe is a halfway house. It's suboptimal, so either we make a big step in terms of integration, or it's not worth it, and we can come backwards. So interestingly, there's a kind of objective alliance here between, I would say, hardcore federalists, so people who want to centralize policy making, and, for instance, people in the UK who want to repatriate. Now, I think here I'm quite sympathetic with the traditional critique against this view, coming from people like Fritz Scharpf or Mayone. Europe's diversity is adverse to excessive centralization, to majoritarian politics. There's a second and linked narrative about two-pillar Europe. It's quite similar in the sense that there would be a political core somehow breaking apart, and there would be a second circle. It's something which you hear a lot these days in the UK, this illusion that you can have a win-win situation with an integrated core, a kind of community, and the rest. Well, in fact, we know that Europe is about overlapping circles. Cooperations have different perimeters. We live in a reality of differentiating integration. So I start from this reality of differentiating integration, and that's where I come up with this idea or this concept of platform. And it's very speculative, so I'm just here to share it with you. Platform, I borrow the concept from the digital world, and we can think of Facebook and Twitter or LinkedIn and so on. So it's basically a website which attracts a lot of people, members, and from which members can easily navigate, build new cooperations, partner with each other. So a very flexible tool. So there's a quote here from the Harvard Business Review, which basically suggests that businesses should today evolve or move towards platform thinking. So basically being open, this idea of a co-creation of value. And in fact, I was really inspired by a French book which was published a few years ago about the digital transition, and there is a chapter in it which is called the state as a platform, and I think we can apply the same kind of thinking to the EU. So to illustrate that, I suggest that this EU platform has four main characteristics, and here I borrow from existing literature. There's nothing really new. So the first one is that a platform is an exclusive club, so there is a membership which gives access to rights, to some goods, but at the same time which requires some loyalty. That means members won't go to other platforms, or maybe to a lesser extent, and some responsibilities. And interestingly, this notion of club, so you can imagine also within the EU different clubs or different level of memberships giving access to different types of goods. The second characteristic is for the EU to be a risk-sharing, problem-solving facility. So this I mentioned earlier. So managing interdependence within Europe. So this internal aspect. The third characteristic is about the platform itself, because it has a legal entity and it forms a single entity outside. What it provides, it's a source of power, it's a source of collective sovereignty. And this is, I think, interesting as an answer or as a reply to those who are concerned about sovereignty, about national sovereignty. You have, yeah, no problem. This notion of European or collective sovereignty is not an easy sell because sovereignty is traditionally associated to states, but I think in practical terms it can work. And there is some evidence for that, in the trade sector, in the peace process in Ukraine, and so on. And finally, fourth characteristic, and that's probably the one which is the closest to the digital world. A platform is an infrastructure which is open to users, initiatives. So member states should be able very easily to suggest new initiatives, to experiment, to propose amendments. And perhaps it's on this particular point that some progress needs to be made, because it seems like the price tag to, for instance, launch enhanced cooperations or some form of reinforced cooperation is too high today. So there might be some work here to do. Now, I would just want to conclude by referring to other concepts or other approach which are very similar. Now you might think, yeah, in fact the platform thinking is quite similar to differentiated integration. I think it's true. Clearly I've been inspired by that, but at the same time I quite like this notion of plug and play with the platform. So members or individuals can just go to the platform and take initiatives. While differentiating integration, you still have this notion of integration, maybe with a center leading the way. And at the same time, of course, I'm quite interested in, for instance, what Jan Zielonka writes. I don't know if you know. If you're familiar with him, but he has this notion of what the EU should be about polyphony. It should be radically decentralized. It should be about networks. And I think it's true, but at the same time, if you want to do that, you need a strong center. Because this illusion that it can happen on its own, I don't think it's very valid. You need a strong center to organize things, to provide some tools, and also to have some form of collective power outside. And that's where I disagree with Cameron when Cameron has this very famous this sentence: the EU should not be about the rigidity of a bloc; it should be about the flexibility of a network. Well, this clearly I think is spin. So because I think it doesn't work. It can't be just decentralized. So I leave it here. Yeah, I hope you found that interesting.
Thank you very much, Renaud. So now we have time for discussion and questions. And as a moderator, I have been asked to have some sort of questions in my pocket, but I can see already that there are members of the audience that would like to make some questions. So there will be microphones circulating around, and I think it's much more important for you to jump into the discussion directly. So, Professor Jörges, I think.
No, thank you all. It was, for me, very interesting to listen, because we all have the feeling that something is not in a good state in Europe, and how do you react? Now, I want to start with you and your notion of, well, I don't care, I don't know. I look into the sondage, yeah? There is agreement on the euro in Greece, hence, even if the Greeks believe the euro is a good thing, it must be a good thing. But then, and this was nice, at the end, you really had a much more ambitious notion of legitimacy, I would say. This, what you said about the platform, is something which I think is indeed a new kind of comprehension of the European beast and how it works. And there may be much more positive stuff there. But okay, I'm saying you are doing actually a ambitious talk about legitimacy. Now this brings me, Jan, to you. It's of course sad to hear Joseph Weiler saying it's an empty notion. I mean, he's hosting a very expensive program, the Max Weber program. And one of the fundamental achievements of Max Weber was exactly his writing on legitimacy. And the bridging of it was so interesting that he said people must not just accept, they must also believe that this is a good thing we live in. Otherwise, legitimacy will break down. And I'm just saying this is where I feel your notion of legitimacy has to. I just wonder, are you situating your critique or your search for a new legitimacy? And as a German, second point, Max Weber, our constitutional court bashing in Germany is a Volkssport, you know, everybody does that. But at the same time, one wonders a bit, why is the European Court such a sacrosanct thing? If I look at a judgment like Pringle or the OMT judgment on which I will talk tomorrow, which is actually transforming Europe in a technocratic regime. Every power to the central bank. Nobody cares. And I think it is as worth to talk about this as this German court who, according to Weiler, always barks and never bites. He bites, they bite. Okay, but again, it is a problem of perception of, well, if you say Europe is now in a position where the output of Europe has been questionable, or Mayone says Europe is inefficient. That is the worst thing Mayone can say about something. And now, then Europe has to respond by delivering, and this applies also to the court. So the acceptance of jurisprudence of the court will also depend upon the ability of the court to give convincing reasons of what they do. Why should Draghi have all these powers? And this is a question, and I don't think they answer. Okay.
Thank you. We'll get more questions and pile them up, and then you can have an opportunity to reply. There was another question here.
Hi, thank you. So I have a question for Carlos and another for Jan. So the question for Carlos is, you said at some point that formalizing exit might deteriorate loyalty, right? But I don't know if that is quite true. I mean, think on the example of marriage, you know, I mean, formalizing the right to divorce, it's not obviously that it will deteriorate, right, the loyalty. I think that it might actually strengthen loyalty because, I mean, every member in the marriage, right, is allowed actually to go if he or she wants. And I think that gives value actually to the commitment that they have to stay together while they want to stay together. And I think that applies to the UK, right? So I think that if the British people want to leave the EU, I think they should leave the EU, and I think it's healthy actually for the union, right? That everyone has a very clear, unconditional, quite straightforward right to go if they want, right? So I think that gives value to the union, I think. So and to Jan, so I think I'm pleased that you want to leave aside this sociological idea of legitimacy, right? So, and then if we don't go that way, if we don't go in the way to, I mean, just making polls about what the people think about the EU, then we must engage in some kind of normative assessment, right? This is what legitimacy is. But then if we want to assess the EU or whatever from this normative point of view, I think I agree that, this reflexive idea of becoming part of the reflection and so on, I totally agree with that. I like this. But I think you should be explicit about what kind of values are you using to make a normative assessment, because if you are assessing, you need to use some values, right? And I think that it all depends on that, because if the values you want to apply are democratic values, for instance, which we might agree that these should be the values that we should apply when we assess legitimacy, then it all depends on how you conceive democracy and what kind of values are you using and everything. And regarding to this, I think, so I'm a little bit worried about this idea of myths, because I think, I can see the force of myths when you want, as you said, when you want to bring people to do things and mobilize people and things like this. But implicit in the idea of myths is the idea of deception, right? So I think that when you use myths to move the people to do certain things, in a way you are deceiving the people, right? So you are putting some kind of symbolic thing in the middle, which does not speak to them in terms of reasons for doing things or incentives or right. And I think I know that that's not what you were trying to do, right? So I can recognize that myths have some constructive force as well, but there's always something worrisome in using these kind of things.
If you would like to reply to this first set of questions, I think you have at least one each. So maybe, Jan, we start with you.
Thank you very much. These are great questions, and I don't say that because it's just a nice thing to say, but it really invites me to go back to the paper and realize what I didn't say, what I was thinking about saying, and starting with the place of normative beliefs and also this normative side of legitimacy, because that's in fact precisely what I wanted to look at or wanted to convey, that we cannot just do with the descriptive notion of legitimacy, because we always need to ask, so why people have these beliefs? And that also relates to the second question. And that's what I'm precisely interested in. So that's why I say we must investigate what are the good reasons why people can believe that something is legitimate or something is not legitimate. How it perhaps relates to the idea of the narrative and myth is also we very much focus on reasons and we don't talk about emotions, especially lawyers don't do that because law is an embodiment of reason, right? We are not emotional because for emotions you have loud politicians can engage in emotions, but not lawyers. But they must be an important part of make something legitimate. Because what I tried to reject in my presentation, and it's really the first time I'm talking about it, so that's perhaps I wasn't that clear as I perhaps would want to be, that I do not want to construe this dichotomy between descriptive and normative, because to me they are just interlinked, and something you may have a great idea what would be legitimate, but if it doesn't work, if it doesn't really induce these beliefs, then it's not really part of how I understand legitimacy. So that's why I think the two are interlinked. Now, because I'm talking about legitimacy and that I should be more explicit about that. That was the last part of the paper, which I in fact didn't present to you because that's something I really don't feel comfortable to present as a kind of lawyer talking about political philosophy. But I don't think democracy is the right language to use, and nor is the language of fairness, because they are quite empty. They are with fairness, and that's in fact, I did the same thing, that fairness can be many things, and you do not really need to engage in substantive reasons why people would deem something legitimate. So, and now it's not I would be like thinking deeply about, but I got quite attracted by the recent book by Axel Honneth and the idea of freedom, and freedom in its different realizations. And one reason I like it is also that he takes seriously different spheres of human life. So while to me, constitutional theorists especially focus very much on the political sphere, and the market and the economic sphere is something to be kept separate in the good tradition of liberalism, which tries to separate these spheres. What is, I think, a call for constitutional lawyers is just somewhat take the market more seriously, and through this notion of freedom is perhaps the way how to do it. But that's really not something I would be thinking a lot about. But that's perhaps a honest response, right, based on that. How it can relate to the idea of democracy, and it also is my obsession as a lawyer with the market, which again for political economists it's something they have been doing for very long, but when you read constitutional scholarship on the European Union, market is not really critically engaged. And when you have this idea of democracy as a government for the people, by the people, and of the people, I never understood what of the people can mean, because for the people it's quite clear, it's for us, like by the people we elect the government, but of the people can in the government be someone else than the people. And then I realized that when Lincoln was putting these words, he meant aristocracy. So aristocracy like them, not us, the people. But today it's perhaps either technocracy or the governance of abstract mechanisms, the market mechanism, so that in fact the government is put in place by us, the people, like the Greeks, they in the end accept that they are in the monetary union, which in fact just cancels their democracy. And what in fact governs is the market mechanism, so the abstract mechanism. So that's why this of the people is again quite important to engage with. Right. And if I still may, because I really find this, it's really great, because I have this paper I present for the first time and I get these great questions. Just very little bit about the Court of Justice, because again, I didn't want to create an impression that I want to defend the court. And in fact, this idea that you can defend the premise of EU law with reference to legal values, such as formal equality or pacta sunt servanda or whatever may have, I don't find it persuasive at all. And that's precisely the deficit of lawyers, that they do not look beyond the notions which are dear to them. And I also agree that reasons are very important for the legitimacy of judicial institutions. And on that, again, I agree with Kristen that when you read the judgments by the European Court of Justice, it's just deficient, if I again can use this, another deficit of reasons in court's reasoning. So, well, thank you very much.
I'm not sure a question was addressed to me, but I mean, thanks very much for your comments. If I may just say one thing, it's about the exit issue, because I feel quite strongly about that. And I mean, the assumption I took in my paper was that basically because I tend to sympathize with the sociological approach to legitimacy and Weber, and I mean, ultimately, if it's accepted, if people don't want to walk away or get rid of something, it is, I mean, we can consider it legitimate. Now, I know it might be a bit controversial to say that, and it doesn't correspond to the normative approach, but yeah, I tend to think that, like you, an exit clause is actually interesting in the sense that it reinforces the value of membership. And if you think the EU is not legitimate, the best thing to do is to go away.
Thank you. So,
Thank you.
what do we do with divorce?
Yeah, I think one of the worst. The worst contributions to this debate is the analogy with divorce that has been used also for secession. I think I am not really taking a superficial stance on that. I think it's very important to separate. Divorce appeals to an institution, and it's an institution which nevertheless is based on feelings. And we are not speaking here about feelings, we are speaking about values, which I think are substantively different to feelings. So feelings can disappear, but values cannot. So you can feel say respectful or sincere or honest towards your partner. Those are values. Feelings are about love and sharing understanding of life. It's a different feel, right? I think we should not really mix them together. So why I do not consider withdrawal to be useful? Basically, something I haven't said in my presentation, relates to the analysis that is in the background of this, which is rational choice analysis. And rational choice analysis, the whole literature about secession. There is no specific literature about withdrawal from international organizations. There is a little bit of that. But the whole coincidence that the existence of this kind of clauses, provisions, favor strategic behavior. And this rational choice is not based on normative assessments of the organization. So it's not, there is no evidence that this kind of mechanism contributes to overvalue membership. But furthermore, let me add a couple of reasons which I think are important. First, exit is meaningful for powerful member states. And that happens the same with unanimity rule. I have studied in detail, in deep the unanimity rule. Those rules are meaningful for those states that can really exert meaningful threats. And let me put a very clear example. There was a certain government in Europe that threatened to exit, and the value of this threat was the ability to make the whole thing fail. And I'm speaking about the Greek government, about the euro crisis. The threat was not believable because the costs were higher always for the Greek government and the Greek state. So the threat only is meaningful if your power to exercise a threat is believable by other partners. So in that respect, you can see that as the president of Luxembourg said in 2004 when the European Constitution, if Luxembourg has voted yet against the Constitution, we'll be voting again to obtain a yes. And that's the case of Ireland. If France votes no, it's a no. Right? Unanimity, withdrawal, these kind of provisions play always in the hands of those who can really exercise the threat, not in the weakest players. And the second factor, which I think is relevant, is that it's a rule that cannot be played by more than one player. So once you exercise withdrawal provisions once, as my friend used to say, Daniel used to say, the structure of the union changes dramatically. It's a place in which you can enter and exit at will based on utilitarian calculations. Now, the point here is that there is no single organization, and perhaps I have some disagreements with something that has been said before. There is no single organization that can be sustained on the basis of sheer calculation. Absolutely not, because you can never score a kind of zero-sum game for all participants, unless so you have 28 participants we have nowadays in the European Union. Nevertheless, you may perhaps be tempted to find a kind of rational choice equilibrium point in which this happens, but I don't know any case. And if I may add something about what Christian said about the value of courts, because I hinted at that in my presentation when I referred to the position that the British government has taken on the judgments of the European Court of Justice. I think it's very different to distinguish between what the court does, the judgments and the rulings, and the value of the institution, which is something different. And of course, there is a kind of circular relation between the rulings and sentences play in the way we interpret the situation. But I think accepting the rule of a given institution, in this case courts, also implies accepting a certain degree of fallibility. That is not, it is unavoidable in human design institutions. Hence, I think we should perhaps separate these two elements in our criticism of the court. What the court does vis-à-vis what the institution is.
I don't know if there's any more questions before we go for our coffee break, which is almost a lunch break right now. But I would like to ask you also, since there has been reference to the court, I would like to ask perhaps all three of you, how do you, first to Renaud, how do you integrate this notion of the court being like as an umpire of integration and of the limits of competencies between member states and the union, and of the extent of the obligations, the contractual obligations that have been entered into by the states by entering the union? In this platform, what sort of place would the court have in your EU platform? That's one. I have also a question for Jan, also taking up the difficulties with somehow the role of courts generally when it comes to legitimacy issues and crises of legitimacy in the member states as well, not just in the European Union. To a certain extent, courts are now the focus of attention for solving problems that perhaps are more initially designed constitutionally to be left to the political domain, the political arena, rather than the pure judicial arena. So in this extent, do you think that forcing the courts or trying to persuade the courts to jump into political conflicts through judicial decisions can imply also a sort of deterioration of this legitimacy crisis? And then I would like to ask Carlos, also if following from the jurisprudence of the court has, I think, was quite revolutionary in the beginning in creating a new narrative about integration. And this narrative was, I'm trying to be very synthetic, was that integration was not just a matter of the member states. There was another important agent in integration, and that was, of course, the citizens or the persons and so on. Now, if we apply this new narrative that the court brought along, how does the classical theorization of voice and exit and loyalty add up to this new element in the triangle, which is, of course, the citizens? How do they play into this exit and voice dynamics? So maybe just a little question for each of you, that you can, of course, deal with a very short and brief reply.
Thank you for this challenging question. I haven't really thought through the role of the court in my platform vision. But I guess in the four characteristics I mentioned, well, the first one was about loyalty and responsibilities, and the second one was about problem solving. And I guess these two aspects have to be regulated somehow by the court. So I don't think it changes anything in particular here in the traditional role of the Court of Justice. Now, maybe the perhaps more difficult point is when, if I take a very concrete example, when some member states want to form an enhanced cooperation. Here there might be some, and if this is going to happen more often, we might see increasingly the case of member states basically taking another group of member states to the court on the basis of discrimination. So I think I'm not exactly sure here. We need to check with Jan. But on the case of the EU patent, I wonder if there was any dispute of that sort, or I don't know. Well, maybe I'll check that. Another example is, for instance, the UK, the initiative for a financial transaction tax, which is enhanced cooperation. The UK government is ready to take these 11 member states to court because it estimates that this discriminates against those countries which are not member of this cooperation. So if this is happening increasingly, then clearly there's a problem with this flexibility or this easiness of use, which I try to promote.
Thank you. Jan, would you like to respond?
Yeah, I hope I will be brief because this is my home territory. So I try to do a short answer to that. So you were asking about courts focusing on problems or being, in fact, pulled into solving problems which are not really theirs. And I think in that respect, I believe in kind of openness, systemic openness of law. So I don't think there are proper legal questions, and then there are other questions for other institutions. And I think it's more important to look at how you structure the judicial process. So as at some levels you have courts which are capable to deal with such questions because, in fact, law and politics and law and technocracy are intertwined. So I don't think you can completely isolate them. And what is then important is what you can call it communicative arrangement with these other spheres, such as politics and also expertocracy. And the problem in the European Union, I think, is that the European Court of Justice is not embedded in a similar structure as national constitutional courts are at the domestic level. So that's why I warned you that I can be quite long in my presentation, because that's what I was writing about, the displacement of constitutional courts by the European Court of Justice, so that in fact they are being embedded from solving many questions, and that I find problematic. Now, an accusation of this kind of answer is that, again, it's quite helplessly empty, because I only say it's all about communication and deliberative legitimacy and what it means and what are the values behind it. So what I would add to that is that I think law can be, again, enchanted somewhat, that there is some appeal to legal rationality, that there are proper legal values, which is not just instrumentalization of other values which come from other spheres, and those need to be taken seriously. But I think if there is someone to talk about it, then I think it's Christian, because he's, I think, defending these legal values.
Okay, now Carlos, as a specialist also on citizenship, what would you say?
Thank you very much. There is a small thing in your question that I would like to perhaps to clarify, is what is the precise role of the court in arbitrating on Article 50 is actually very limited. It's virtually nothing. It's really procedural. But the important point about your question is about the narrative. Yeah, the narrative you were mentioning about created by the court, and I think it's a very important question. I have now this book project in which I have asked a number of people to reflect specifically what will be the position of citizens, European Union citizens, in a case of a withdrawal from a member state, because there is a lot of doctrine about what will happen with a seceding member state and the rights of citizens, but surprisingly we don't have much about what will happen with withdrawing member state as the citizens. But I think it's kind of a straightforward question, surprisingly, because this development, the withdrawal clause, belongs to the same kind of nature that you have also with Article 1 of the treaty. If you look what happened between the European Union Constitution and the Lisbon Treaty between 2004 and 2010, there is a significant change there in Article 1, which is this treaty is concluded between member states. Lisbon Treaty, this constitution is concluded between member states and the citizens. That's the casualty that you have between 2004 and 2010. Citizens disappear. And this is the same evolution I was asking about when I referred to this gaining autonomy at the same time that increasing the sovereignty of member states, that is the operation with performing with formalization of Article 50. Citizens have disappeared in this movement, in my interpretation. You can derive perhaps the rights of citizens for a withdrawing member states, but who is going to enforce those rights? That's the key question. It's not only that you cannot formalize that, but if your state is withdrawing from the European Union, how you can enforce those rights in a jurisdiction which is not any more recognized by the state to which you belong by nationality. That's a crucial question, which I think is does not find a proper response. So even if I could articulate or elaborate in abstract that citizens for a withdrawing member states retain certain rights under European Union law, I think it will be very doubtful that you can really make that meaningful, because you lack enforcement capabilities for those kind of provisions. And if I can conclude with something referred to withdrawal, I think, and that's important for normative reflection on narratives, is that perhaps we shouldn't be seduced by the aesthetics of certain institutional designs. Withdrawal in that respect is very appealing, is a very beautiful rule, very easy to understand. But we need to look at the pragmatic application on the ground. And the effects that those institutions can produce perhaps can contradict the aesthetics behind that. Okay. Thank you.
We've reached, I think, 12 o'clock. Maybe it's good time to stop for a coffee and thank all our speakers for their excellent presentation. Yes.